People talk a lot about like the idea that we should have philosophy as a standard subject in American middle and high schools, and I'm definitely not opposed to that. I think it would be potentially a very good thing, but I think beyond that, there's a subject that's even more important that I wish was taught in like mainstream, school systems pretty much everywhere. That's information science. Like the ability to understand how to make use of, assess, collect, organize, record information. And you might think that this is really obvious, but it's much more complicated than you'd think. And my evidence for the idea that we just have a complete lack of understanding on a broad social level of information science is that there are a ton of people, a lot of them in the jiu-jitsu community, that think research means going on YouTube and watching a few podcasts and the only way to dissuade them from that is to have a very long conversation about what it entails to actually engage in legitimate research. Information is a very, very difficult thing to define, but my favorite definition that I ever read is that information is the resolution of uncertainty. And that seems to be the source of so many of our problems in the world, that we are living in a world with a great deal of uncertainty, and we will never be able to fully resolve uncertainty, but to the extent that we can, we're making things better for ourselves, which is why I think it's so surprising that this is not widely taught or understood, right? You get taught all these details about different areas of research, but then you're not taught what it means to actually engage in research on an actual legitimate level, right? But you guys have definitely heard the saying that human beings are social creatures, right? A big part of what goes into that is the fact that cooperation, working together, is such a big part of our capacity to achieve wider success, even if you consider yourself a more introverted person, right? I don't want to go too deep onto this because I think it should be very obvious to anyone that cooperation is very important to human success. But two things that go into that are, the first one is, we have to believe that the people with whom we're having discussions are operating in good faith, that they are actually trying to work towards the goals that they say that they're trying to work towards, right? That's not always the case, but that's kind of another topic. We have to assume that that's the case, or we have to be able to infer whether it's the case based on their way of speaking and things like that. Sometimes it's difficult. Second thing that goes into that is that we have to go into conversations with the knowledge that the other person with whom we're discussing has an understanding of how to make use of information effectively, right? We may not even agree on certain things. I think the main things that people typically tend to disagree on are values and on predicted outcomes. This is assuming, again, that both interlocutors are operating in good faith and that they have an understanding of how to make use of information. I think really difficult conversations arise when people are either operating not in good faith, or when you're dealing with, one or maybe both people in the conversation who just don't know how to make use of information. So they fall prey to fallacies pretty frequently. These are things that there's really no way to overcome this without wide social implementation of education on information science. There are mainly two ways in which societies can cohesively cooperate towards goals. The first is through authoritarian measures where people at the top have a lot of authority, and there's a small group of them and they can all cooperate effectively, and they have a monopoly on physical force, and therefore they're able to basically make everyone else do what they want, right? So that's the first way. The second way is much harder, but I think it's better, which is that we have to be able to communicate effectively together and figure out what we're going to do. This is better because it allows for a broader amount of different people with different interests to get to have their say in how things are going to go. And not everyone's going to always get what they want, but they're at least going to have a say. They're going to be able to pitch their case, and we'll have a conversation about it. I think that's ultimately a lot better than an authoritarian system. Example of each of these types of systems would be, for the authoritarian stuff, it would be something like Singapore, where, you might not always agree with the goals of the government, but it's very difficult to argue that they're not extremely effective at achieving the goals that they've set for themselves, right? They're, very, very good at that. For all you can criticize the Singaporean government for, man, they're fucking good at getting stuff done. You have to give them that. And in one sense, then they are working, they're accomplishing things. But the problem is that they're doing it at the expense of allowing people, the wider population to get to have any kind of meaningful say about what's going to happen. So a country that obviously, this is sort of our whole shtick, that we do like to believe that we're a legitimate democracy, is the United States. And I think we are, in some sense, like a fairly healthy democracy, and we have been able to accomplish quite a lot, despite the fact that there's a lot of different people with different values and different interests. What really worries me about the United States is like how intensely polarized everything is becoming, and I think so much of that is because people fall prey to propaganda and manipulation because they just don't understand how to assess and make use of information. Without that, it's really easy to fall prey to emotional manipulation and propaganda. And there's no possible way we're going to be able to function as a society consistently if we're allowing a wide variability of opinions to have their say, but then we have to be able to communicate effectively. And there's no way to do that unless you understand how to make use of information. There's literally no way to do it without that. You stuck with me this far into this rant. A recommendation I have is, this is just a basic recommendation when it comes to dealing with information. Don't go into topics assuming or wanting a specific outcome when you assess the data. Just look at the data and see what it naturally seems to imply. And furthermore, it's going to be hard to really assess it accurately without a deep understanding of the wider context. So understand also that it's going to probably take you a long time to form a really genuinely well-informed opinion. It's not going to be something that happens overnight.
I don't think the system works.
How would you have it work?
We need a system where the politicians sit down and discuss the problem, agree what's in the best interest of all the people, and then do it.
That's exactly what we do. The trouble is that people don't always agree.
Well, then they should be made to.
By whom? Who's gonna make them?
I don't know. Someone.
You?
Of course not me.
But someone.
Someone wise.
Sounds an awful lot like a dictatorship to me.
Well, if it works.
I genuinely think all Americans, or just people who grow up in so-called Western democracies, should go to Singapore and spend at least a little bit of time there and then read about its history, because we oftentimes like to think of authoritarian dictatorships as being just these fundamentally evil, terrible things, and oftentimes that's what they are. And I'm not supporting authoritarianism, I'm very against it. But we have to understand that there's also a sense in which authoritarianism can be used to accomplish things more effectively than democracies. And if we don't want to turn into that, we need to understand why it is that authoritarianism is oftentimes more effective at getting these things done, and what sorts of things democracies need to do so as to be able to achieve those same goals. And Singapore is a country that demonstrates that you do not need to be a legitimately functioning democracy in order to effectively get things done, and quite frankly, just be a nice place to live. Because Singapore is a very nice place to live. The problem isn't that it's not a nice place to live. The problem is that ultimately the people don't have rights. You don't get a say in your government. And that to me as an American is something that's fundamentally important. Maybe it's just an idealistic thing that I hold on to, but it is something that I value, and I want to be able to see the government that I live under simultaneously both respect my freedom and human rights while also being capable of organizing effectively to solve common problems that we all share cooperatively. It's important to understand the motivation behind someone like Anakin Skywalker in that last scene, or someone in Singapore, for instance, like Lee Kuan Yew, who was the first prime minister of the country. Like, think about the situation most Southeast Asian countries find themselves in. They're very poor, right? Singapore, by contrast, is extremely wealthy. It's a very nice place to live. The standard of living in Singapore is unparalleled in Southeast Asia, right? The part of the world that Singapore is in. Similarly, Anakin Skywalker grew up as a literal slave on Tatooine. When you have a government that is more authoritarian in its implementation, you are more able to effectively control for like chaotic situations, because you don't need to account for the opinions of various people. Assuming that people at the top are intelligent, and in the case of Singapore, I think that's oftentimes the case, things will get done because you don't need to worry. And when you have a situation where, you're in a part of the world where every other country is in dire poverty, or, you were a former literal slave, right? These sorts of things, authoritarianism becomes very appealing because you can account for variables more effectively. You can accomplish things with far greater ease. Look at the way in which China has been capable of growing economically, in the last few decades. It's fucking unparalleled, right? They don't have to worry about accounting for the opinions of various different people. So then that poses a challenge for us that would prefer to continue to live in democracies. How do we make it the case that democracies are equally as effective at accomplishing these sorts of things? And the only way to do it is with a widespread, we all need to become better communicators, and in order to do that, we all need to become more competent at understanding how information works. I'll end this sort of rant with one final comment on why this matters to me. Lee Kuan Yew, who's again the first prime minister of Singapore, famously used to shit on New York City as an example of a city that he didn't want Singapore to turn into. And you guys have definitely heard all the criticisms of New York. It's very dirty, it smells like shit, there's a lot of homeless people. All of those things are completely and 100% true. New York has a lot of problems. It's a place filled with many different people from many different places who have different values, and because there's an actual democratic system in place, people oftentimes disagree on how they want to run things. But I will say this, New York may be smellier than Singapore, maybe dirtier, there may be more crime, there may be more homeless people, but as we speak right now, there is a mentally disabled man who is about to be executed for nonviolent drug offenses in Singapore. And at the same time, if I want to, I can go back to my apartment and legally smoke a joint. So I think that what I'm advocating is worth fighting for, despite the risks and despite the fact that, yeah, it might smell a little bit more like shit in New York City rather than Singapore.